started here, 6:30. Everyone get a seat, we have plenty of chairs. You guys want to sit down in the back? Okay. Good turnout. Thanks for everyone for showing your interest in this project. This is the second public forum that the Vernon Planning and Economic Development Commission, as we're known, has conducted to discuss a possible gas-powered electric generating plant for Vernon. And what we're going to do is, much like we did in our November forum, is have about a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation and then turn it over to our moderator, Tim Johnson, and have discussion. I want to introduce our Planning Commission members. I'm Bob Spencer. Janet Rasmussen is our Vice Chair. Next to her is Patty O'Donnell, Maddie Arms, Brett Morrison, and Martin Langeveld. And you know Tim. So I think it's important that everyone know here that there is no formal proposal from a development company at this point for this project. It's been kind of frustrating actually for us because we've been meeting with this group for a year and a half and no site's been proposed, no exact design. So it's a concept. And there's we have a lot of questions, and you guys have lots of good questions too. And we won't be able to answer a lot of questions tonight until we know more about it. So what our goal tonight was to take the top concerns and issues that we heard at the November meeting and try to address them tonight, get them on the table. We're hoping to have a really positive discussion where there's obviously a lot of concerns, unknowns. It's a big project with 25, 35 years of potential impact or more here in town. And also it has a huge potential positive environmental and economic impacts to the region. The environmental impacts, positive, could be giving a base load power source to support development of renewable energy, wind and solar. Positive economic development, obviously lowered energy costs and long-term tax revenue for the town and probably the state. So we're trying to assimilate all this information, and I'm going to talk the second part of the presentation about the permitting process. So with that, the vote? Oh yes, thanks, Mark. Also, if you got the flyer that was mailed out, it discusses a town non-binding referendum on March 1st. When you vote at town offices, that we will have a separate voting station where you could pick up a ballot and vote on a very straightforward question. Do you support the siting of a possible gas generating plant in the town of Vernon? There also are absentee ballots available. So, are you ready, Martin? So we'd like to hold the questions till we get through the presentation because we'll never get through it.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure why every time we have to do this, they all point at me, but I seem to be elected. I also want to mention right up front here that the board has not taken a vote. We have no position as a board on this. We've really tried to just explore the issues and gather the information and get it in a format that we can present to you. And really, because there has been no formal proposal to us is the reason that we haven't formally taken a position. So here we go. First, some background. If you were here before in the November meeting, you're gonna see some of the same slides. You're also gonna see some new slides, especially from Bob. But, you know, since there are new people here, what we wanna do is go through the basics again, but we've condensed it a little bit from the last time. So one piece of background is the state of New England's power grid. New England is losing about 4,000 megawatts of generating capacity. It has lost some of that, and the rest of it is slated to be shut down. That includes Vermont Yankee, which was about a little over 600 megawatts, and so the total generating capacity of the grid that's going away is the equivalent of at least 6 Vermont Yankees, and then there's another 4,500 megawatts of capacity that is considered to be at risk. Older plants, coal plants, things like that could be shut down. So the result of this is that there could be significant increases in the wholesale cost of electricity. There could be a lot of volatility as the supply and demand kind of evens out. And there could be challenges to the regional and the Vermont grid reliability. Another piece of background is that there is this pipeline that I'm sure you've all heard about that is being proposed and is in the permitting process right now. It's called the Kinder Morgan Northeast Energy Direct Pipeline. It's a $3.3 billion project to build a pipeline from Pennsylvania over to Draycote, Mass. to expand the supply of natural gas and electric generating capacity in New England. And the route of that pipeline runs through Western Mass, then up through Northfield into Winchester, New Hampshire, and then east through the southern tier of New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, mostly over utility rights-of-way, existing rights-of-way. And as I said, that's in the permitting process and is proposed to be in service November of 2018. Here's a map of that pipeline. The purple line there, let's see if we can do this. Right here, it goes up into Northfield here and then across the southern tier and then out to Draycote. A little closer look, this is Vernon right here. We are sort of over here. Here's the Connecticut River, here's Route 10 up into Winchester, and so the pipeline comes out of Northfield, crosses the state line here, and goes on east from there. Another piece of background is Vernon's tax base. Back in the 80s, 90s, Entergy or Vermont Yankee was 80 to 90% of the total grand list in Vernon. Since about 1998, it's been gradually coming down to around this 40% level. And as we know, with the plant closed, it's basically going to come off the tax rolls almost entirely. Right now, it is taxed at $230 million. The tax rate is 46 cents per 100 valuation. The calculation, and this $230 million valuation is for this current fiscal year. The valuation going forward is now under negotiation. And so when that valuation, if that valuation goes down, for example, and we don't know where it's going to land, but we know that it's going to go down from here. If it goes down to $100 million, the tax rate goes to 64 cents. 75 million, 66 cents, and so forth. If the valuation were to go to zero, it would be 75 cents, up from 46 to 75. Now, that's if nothing else is done, if there's no savings, or if there's no new development in town that adds to the tax rolls. Looking at that in terms of house value, if your house is worth $150,000, you're paying $610 right now on the municipal side. None of this includes the school tax. And if the VUI valuation were to go down to 25 million, you'd be paying $1,093 in 2021. $250,000 house goes from a little over 1,000 to 1,800. So, you know, the tax would go up on a house like that, either 57%, if the valuation is 100 million, or 79% if it's 25, or somewhere in between, or it could even be higher if the valuation doesn't end up at 25. So all of this kind of adds up to this opportunity that's been presented to us of building a gas-fired electric generating plant in Vernon. It would be a 600 megawatt plant, which is about equal to what VUI was. It would take up about 20 acres after it was built. During the construction, it would be about 40 acres. The building would be a power block which is 50 or 60 feet high with a stack that's 215 feet high, which is the same as the existing VUI stack. It would connect to the Velco switch yard and substation, and it would also connect to the pipeline via about a 7-mile spur over into New Hampshire, which could follow the existing rights of utility rights of way that are over there, although that route itself has really not been mapped out or even explored. The cost to build a plant would be about $750 million, give or take 10%. So reasons for talking about doing this in Vernon. The reason this is being proposed to us is that, number one, there is the existing Velco switchyard, a very important resource. It's close to the pipeline, as you saw. There's no other town in Vermont that's as close to that pipeline. It's also close to an interstate highway and a railroad, which is handy for getting parts and supplies and so forth in. And it's close to the Connecticut River. These are kind of all elements that you need to build a gas plant. The water that would be drawn out of the Connecticut River would be used for cooling, but very little, if any, warm water would be released back into the river, certainly much less than the releases from VY. This is a schematic of a plant, more or less the kind that we're talking about. This is a cutaway view. You see the turbines and things in there. For scale, here's a tractor trailer truck, so that kind of gives you an idea of how big it is. This really, you know, the footprint of this would not be 20 acres by itself, but probably just a few acres. But the 20 acres includes parking, access, and whatever kind of buffer zone is left around the plant. These modern gas generating plants would be combined cycle, which means it recaptures normally wasted heat energy and uses it to generate more electricity. So it's a much higher energy efficiency than coal or gas, which are typically 30 or 35%. This would be up to 60% efficient, and as a result uses less fuel to generate a given amount of electricity. Where would it be? We don't really know yet. Again, there's no specific proposal, but we know that it would have to be within a reasonable distance of the existing switchyard and substation there. It could be on pieces of Entergy-owned property that are outside of the protected area of Vermont Yankee. It cannot be inside the fence line until they finish decommissioning that someday. Or it could be on other property in the vicinity. As I said, it only needs about 20 acres and 20 more temporarily during construction. Those extra 20 don't even really have to be contiguous. They could be somewhere down the road. So again, we don't know where, but, you know, probably if you drew a half-mile circle around where you're sitting, somewhere in there is where the location would be. Bob mentioned economic benefits. During the construction period, there would be 400 to 600 jobs over an 18 to 24 month period. We've checked this out with a couple of other locations where plants have been built or are being built, and that seems to be the right number. The plant itself would employ only 25 to 30 people. This is not another VY in terms of employment levels. There would be some contractors used, just like at VY, for maintenance and whatnot. Obviously, there's a little multiplier effect, meaning that, you know, if you create 25 or 30 jobs, somewhere out there it creates another 10, 15 jobs in other areas, just because people are spending their money locally. And it would help to stabilize the local real estate values, which I think we're seeing fluctuating a little bit right now. Other benefits are that once you have a pipeline spur that comes to somewhere in this vicinity, it could be extended, or a smaller pipeline could be extended up to Brattleboro or even Putney to supply both residential and commercial customers. Right now, we know that there are businesses in Brattleboro and in Putney that are trucking in compressed natural gas at much higher cost, obviously, and, you know, some safety concerns. You don't want too much of this stuff driving up and down the roads. And so these businesses would benefit from lower rates for their gas. It could even be something that helps to attract businesses to locate here. We know, for example, that there's already a proposal from Keene to have a spur run from the projected pipeline up to Keene and supply residences and businesses there with natural gas. As it happens, there already is a gas system in Keene. It's piped propane. And so they would substitute the natural gas for the propane, but they could also expand it once they had a reliable natural gas supply. So they're looking at the economic benefits. So it also helps to address the shortages in the grid, stabilize the electricity rates, and as Bob said, it balances the renewables generation in Vermont and helps to diversify energy sourcing. What would it do to property taxes? That, of course, depends on what the grand list value would turn out to be, but we think it would be up to $750 million. That compares with VY in its last year of operation was $300 million. It's now $230, and it's going to go down from there. A gas plant would start at the top of the depreciation curve. So, you know, it would start at that $750 million ballpark and then gradually go down from there. So it also would preserve the taxable value of the existing switchyard and substation by making that more valuable in terms of distribution of electricity. If that turns out to be not terribly useful to the grid because there's no longer VY in the picture, then the valuation of that could go down as well. So now we get into some of the questions that have been asked, criticisms that have been made, and we've looked into as much of this as we could. So one of the things people say is, well, what about renewable energy? Aren't we all supposed to be going towards wind and solar? So the thing there is that in many places, gas is being looked at as the best possible way to balance out your energy supply when you have a lot of solar and wind in the mix. We know that the wind doesn't blow all the time, sun doesn't shine all the time, so you need a backup source or some way to store energy. Storage is really not economically available yet on the scale that we're talking about. And so the feeling is that gas is the cleanest, most cost-effective option for backup power in a system that is looking to move more towards renewable sources. Safety, we mentioned this last time. What are the risks? It's gas, it burns, it explodes. Well, we know that Kinder Morgan has an excellent safety record for its own gas pipelines. The safety records of gas plants and long-distance gas pipelines generally is very safe, but we do know, we've all heard about this gas plant in Middletown, Connecticut, which exploded a few years ago, and so there certainly is a concern about the safety and fire safety of these sorts of plants. The plant in Middletown, which some members of the board went to visit before the November presentation, the accident there happened during the startup phase. It was not yet in operation. It's something that they learned a lot of lessons from. And it was also a little bit peculiar to that particular situation in that the plant was kind of in a hollow, low area, and apparently the gas pooled there in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen in other places. But it remains a concern. We also get asked about fracking. And we know that some of the opposition to, for example, to the pipeline comes from fracking. And we feel that as a board or as a town, we really don't think we can address that issue or solve that issue. We are already, all of us here, are customers and beneficiaries of gas and oil extracted using fracking techniques. If you're driving your car down the road, if you're heating with oil, if you're using gas or propane, some of that is extracted using fracking. And whether that pipeline is built or not, the gas from Marcellus is going to continue to flow, and this pipeline will just carry a small fraction of it. So, and still, whether it's fracked or not, natural gas is cleaner than most of the other possible forms of energy. Some of the concern about fracking has to do with methane that is released, and our understanding is that at Marcellus, the methane releases and other kinds of environmental impacts are being reduced. We looked at emissions, noise, things like that. I'm going to skip emissions because I've got a new slide on that. Noise is really not a significant concern. It's at the fence line, it's 60 decibels. And to put that in context, it means that it's like a commercial air conditioning unit if you're standing 100 feet away from it. Or, if you like my other example from last presentation, if you have a cat that purrs particularly loud, and that cat is sitting on your lap, that's 60 decibels. So that's all the noise you're going to hear from this plant. The visual impact is certainly less than VY. It's 15% of the VY footprint. There's less light. There's a lot less traffic because there's only about 5% of the employment that we've had in the past at VY. There is little, if any, elevated temperature water added to the Connecticut River, and some of the construction traffic impacts could be reduced by shipping things in by rail. Finally, under environmental impacts, there's the question of decommissioning. First of all, because when the time comes to decommission this plant, the nature of the materials are such that it's a much simpler process. There's not a lot of materials with with major pollution concerns. There's no radioactivity like you deal with in a nuclear plant. And generally, when these plants are built, there is a decommissioning fund that is set up so that that's a covered cost. Here's a little bit on the emissions of various kinds of pollutants. These are numbers which are per billion BTUs of energy, that energy input, and it's looking at natural gas versus oil versus coal. So the carbon dioxide, that's output, much less, still significant, but much less than oil and coal. Carbon monoxide, a little bit more than oil, a lot less than coal. Nitrogen oxides, a lot less than oil or coal. Sulfur dioxide, very little. These are all in pounds per billion BTUs. So, 1 pound versus 1,100 pounds with oil, or 2,500 pounds with coal. Particulates, much less. Mercury, 0 versus smidgen at least of mercury from oil and coal. So what are the steps involved in this whole process? How do we get from here to a gas plant being built if we do? The very first step is community buy-in. So that's why we're here, that's why we gathered in November, that's why we're doing all this research and discussions, and that's why there's a non-binding vote coming up. The developers would walk away, would not be interested if this town says clearly we're not interested in having this plant. So community buy-in is number one. Right now, the pipeline, which it also wouldn't happen if the pipeline is not built. That pipeline proposal is now in front of the FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they probably have a few other hurdles to jump over before the pipeline gets built. But assuming that happens, then concurrent to the construction of the pipeline, the developers would work on the feasibility plan, design work. They would get what's called capacity nomination, meaning essentially a place they can plug into the pipeline and get gas up here. The plant has to get a clean air permit. It has to be approved by ISO New England, which is the organization that kind of runs and regulates the grid and worries about things like those 4,000 megawatts that are disappearing. There's also a bunch of state approvals that have to happen, and Bob's going to talk about those. They come under Section 248, and if all of that happens, then construction would start. How does it get paid for? There are two stages involved here. One is the sort of the feasibility stage, which is really quite risky because during the whole permitting process, something could go wrong or get turned down, and whatever money has been spent drawing plans and so forth is lost. So that's very speculative. It's venture capital type of investing. Once a plant like this is fully permitted and ready to go, shovel ready, as they say, and you can begin construction, then it is funded with bond and equity funding, typically via private equity investors. Much safer investment once it becomes kind of a sure thing. But there would be no public funding from the state of Vermont or the town of Vernon or from consumers in Vermont. How long? When would it be in operation? For how long? It looks like if things move along, it would be 2019 or 2020, but it certainly could take longer than that. The useful life of the plant is basically as long as the plant is competitive. This is not a 20-year, 40-year license situation like we had with VY. It's basically, there are coal generating plants that are well over 50 years. We have a dam right down the road here that's over 100 years old. So, these plants can have a very long lifetime as long as what they're producing still has a market. Question came up last time about exporting this gas and the notion that the whole purpose of this pipeline is to get gas out to Draycote to put it in ships and send it somewhere else. We looked into that. We talked to various people about that. And basically, we found the answer to that is no. First of all, most of the gas that is to be carried by this pipeline is already committed to specific utilities. They've put in their markers to have their share of that. Then it could not be put into ships in Draycote. It has to be, the only way to export it is to send it north to Sable Island, which is in Canada, I believe, where it would have to be converted to liquid natural gas, put into ships. And the only pipeline right now from Draycote to Sable Island carries gas south. And so it would have to be reversed in order to be able to do that. So the exporting notion just doesn't seem to us like it's a credible concern. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. There you go. And he's going to talk about the regulatory permits.
All right, this will put you to sleep. Do I just advance here?
Yep.
I'll tell you, I was assigned this task to look at the permit requirements, and I don't think this is all of them, but this is one of the most regulated activities you could do in the country, but here in Vermont in particular, which is really a good thing, because I concluded most of the questions that are being asked will be addressed in the permitting process. And you'll see the public has full access to ask questions and be heard in hearings and have a say in this process. So first of all, Section 248 of Title 30, this is through our Vermont Public Service Board. They have to issue the CPG, Certificate of Public Good, which Vermont Yankee had. Any energy generating facility has to have it. The Public Service Board must issue a CPG also for construction of the pipeline. So there would be two concurrent approvals. Determining when to grant a permit for Certificate of Public Good, they have to meet a whole lot of regulatory criteria. And they're site specific to this location or whatever location, in terms of wetlands, streams, proximity to homes, everything. And they have to meet the same criteria that are in the state's Environmental Impact Law, Act 250. People say, well, these are exempt from Act 250. Technically, yes, but Act 250 requirements are in this CPG process. And they relate to need, reliability, economic benefit, safety. So I want to know, what's the public participation? Basically, there's two ways. You can be a formal party to a case, and you actually sign up for that, and then you are sent all of the various dockets, and you have legal standing as a party. The town of Vernon automatically will be a party. The Regional Planning Commission will be a party by statute. And any of you who reviewed any of the VY dockets for the various issues, very extensive process. I did serve on Wyndham Regional Commission's Energy Committee, the subcommittee for Vermont Yankee, and I learned a lot about the dockets because we had to review these and then come up with comments. And then anyone who's a member of the public can be a party, which I imagine a lot of people would. Did I jump? Anyone who wants to look into this, there's the link. there's a guidebook called Citizen's Guide to Section 248. It's 30 pages. I didn't even read it all, but I got enough to know that there's a lot of opportunity. So the applicant would be filing a petition with a lot of supporting written testimony and exhibits to address each of the criteria. Environmental and public safety are all about Appendix A of this document. And they don't have a formal application. I said, can I have a copy of the application? They said, no, you just have to answer all of these issues. The biggest permit is the air pollution control permit to construct, and then there's an air pollution control permit to operate. Every single emission unit is regulated, including the combustion turbines, boilers, diesel generators, pumps, cooling towers. And then specific emissions, the compounds that Martin went over, include sulfur dioxide, NOx, particulate matter, which is something of real concern because that's what drops to the ground, lead, carbon monoxide, and then volatile organic compounds. And then any other hazardous chemicals. And if I got a copy of the state air permit application, I also got a copy of the Middletown plant's air permit, and it's the exact same process because it comes under EPA's Title V air permit, which is also required. So it's the same process, and it's very, very detailed in terms of the emissions rates per hour, per year, monitoring. I was actually quite surprised how detailed it was. So you can look at the air permit application at that link. So after the developer files with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, then public comments are invited. Once those comments come in, they're incorporated by the A&R into the draft permit. At that point, it goes to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for review, and then A&R, after that review, can issue the permit. I did speak with the chief engineer for Vermont Air Section who walked me through a lot more detail. The data that they ask is in terms of, like Martin showed you, pounds per hour and tons per year. So they want to know the type of pollution control devices and efficiencies. Because of our air quality in New England, I believe the technology, they call it best available control technology, has to be used. So whatever the best out there on the market to control these emissions will be required. Then there's allowable emissions after the control device. So you put some sort of precipitator or filter, then they have to know what comes out after that. Actual emissions, total emissions, and then the methodology to track compliance. And then if it goes out of compliance, you have to have a plan to bring it back. Public review, it goes into the local newspapers when the application is complete. A&R posts the notice. This is all in the Citizen's Guide to Public Service and the air pollution regs. Public can get additional information. There can be additional public comment periods, and then the EPA can also open up public comment. And it's estimated 1 to 2 years just for the air permit process. I gather from talking to them that these applications for this size plant cost millions of dollars. And Martin mentioned the at-risk money, the venture capital funds. This is where a lot of it goes. Because in the end, you could end up having your permit denied. So I ended up speaking with the deputy commissioner of A&R because I started talking to various staff people. And I say, well, what about this plant? They go, I think you better talk to someone higher up. You better talk to someone higher up. Eventually, they sent me to the commissioner's office, and she said I should talk to Deputy Commissioner Trey Martin, who actually had a conference call with me and 2 of our Planning Commission members for probably an hour and a half explaining this process. Basically, he said that they are now recognizing that they would create a memorandum of understanding, MOU, between the Agency of Natural Resources and the Public Service Board to coordinate all this. This would be a really big project. There's a recently approved transmission line called TDI in northern Vermont, and it sort of is a model for this process. So they just went through this. But that was electrical transmission, not gas. Waste Division has permits for hazardous materials. These are other permits. If they're using any solvents, petroleum products, obviously. They have backup diesel fuel. There's groundwater protection regulations and permits. Indirect waste discharge, such as septic systems and underground water withdrawals, wetlands, stream crossings, stormwater. There's stormwater construction and stormwater once the facility is built. There is a permit, a coordinator for A&R out of Springfield, Vermont, who is the one who quickly said, you gotta talk to Montpelier. Pipeline permits, a whole nother regulatory process. Obviously, depends on the route, what pipeline permits will be required. But if you're looking at crossing streams, which is obvious, that'll have to happen. Through wetlands, yep. Under utility right-of-ways, yep. And then you gotta go through FERC, which is underway for the line in Massachusetts, but FERC would also have to approve a line coming, a spur into Vermont. So, pretty impressive. So we'd like to open this up to questions, and Tim's gonna be our professional, friendly moderator, as usual. So, here you go, Tim.
I'll take that.
All right, so again, as we did last time, please raise your hand and ask to be recognized. Janet will come to you with a microphone, and please use the microphone because this is being recorded for Brattleboro Community TV. We'd ask you to hold your question to 3 minutes in length, question and your statement. And if possible, while there's no way to do it under Vermont's open meeting law, we'd like to give preference, if possible, to Vernon residents, since they're the ones who will be voting on this question on March the 1st. So, again, if you have a question, comment, please raise your hand. Right there, middle row.
Peggy Trust. I assume that there will be high tension lines coming out of this, or transformers, or some type of towers to take the electricity to the switchyard.
Yeah, we saw that in Middletown. 3 of us went to the Middletown plant. There are towers, electric transmission lines right out of the turbine building to the nearest grid connection.
Okay, so how many would there be? I mean, how much area is this gonna take up, and how high are these towers?
I don't know how high. It depends on the facility design and location and proximity. There's a lot of questions, Peggy, that we have no idea until we know a site and the...
Okay, well, that was one of my questions. And I guess it would depend where it's sited, and I'm confused because I know there's been some talk of maybe outside the fenced-in area of BY now. Is that still a possible site? And if so, where is that? I'm not sure if it's near the switchyard, which the switchyard I assume is these silver towers as we come into town?
Right, the switchyard is the silver towers. At the south end of that is where the connection was, or is still, I guess, with Vermont Yankee. And that area is kind of in the protected perimeter of Vermont Yankee and would eventually be needed for decommissioning. So you could not put a gas plant or anything else at that end. But the ideal location really would be, for example, on the other side, on the north side of that switchyard. And then you wouldn't have to have a whole new set of towers. You're basically just connecting from a plant into the switchyard. And that kind of location anywhere in that area would not interfere with BYD decommissioning.
Would that be visible from the road?
I imagine it would be visible from the road, yes.
And how far would that be from the dry cask storage?
It would be on the opposite side of the switch yard from where the dry cask storage is. And it would be completely outside of the existing land that's owned by Vermont Yankee.
But in distance, how far would that be? I have no idea. I've never been down in that area.
Yeah, well, you're probably looking at a quarter mile or so.
Okay.
So you're imagining the thing blowing up and seeing,
Just wanted to know.
yeah.
I did attend a planning board meeting back in early fall, and there was a representative, the lawyer from Sosasmo Industries was in attendance, and it was discussed about the Bemis pit being a possible site, and I wondered if that was still being considered or possible.
Right. Yeah, well, like we said, anything that's, let's say, a half a mile from here or half a mile from the switch yard would probably be a viable location. That includes that pit.
And if it came from that area, the high tension lines would be
Would cross
a lot
over-
longer.
right over our heads here.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay, second row, over on this side.
Jackson, my question would be, the emissions that you showed from the stacks, I guess, do they include emissions from the pipeline, or is that just from the plant?
That is just from the plant, but there would be emissions regulations on the pipeline and any of the valving or venting also.
So do you know what those emissions might be from typical pipelines?
No, we haven't researched pipeline emissions.
And my second question would be, there's a fair amount of concern in the town of Northfield about the construction of the pipeline. Has the planning commission met with any of those folks to discuss any of those concerns?
There's been we haven't been invited to a meeting, no.
Thank you.
Okay, further questions? There's a hand right there.
Dale Gassett. Just as a comment before I ask the question, I know you guys have done a lot of work, but I just think that it's going to be a tough sell to the community unless you can kind of give some definitive locations to where the plant's going to be, because you're asking people to vote on a non-binding referendum for a plant without giving it any kind of location. I know it's a tough deal, but people would have much more of a comfort level if they had an idea of exactly where the plant was going to be. Just a comment. Now, I want to direct a couple of questions towards the Connecticut River, which seems to be a key ingredient in this plant. Am I correct in hearing that somewhere around 3 million gallons of water a day will be used for this plant?
We don't really know, but that was what the Middletown, Connecticut plant was withdrawing. So they were withdrawing water from wells drilled beneath the Connecticut River and not directly out of the river. There's apparently a very strong limestone aquifer, so it didn't adversely impact the stream flows. So what would be needed here, it depends on the size of the plant, the number of turbines. We don't know. But yeah, I think the Connecticut River as a water resource for the plant is one of the main attractions. But as far as how much, I don't know.
So that sort of segues into a question. Who actually has, the Connecticut River is owned by the state of New Hampshire, is that correct?
Yes, but I did look into it. The permit for a facility in Vermont is regulated by Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, not New Hampshire. So water withdrawals, water discharges are all regulated by ANR. And there's also a potential federal U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permitting possible.
All right, well, this isn't a gotcha question, I just want to know,
No.
does the state of New Hampshire weigh in on if the water usage from the Connecticut River? Because, we all know the bureaucratic hurdles that we have to climb over, and I'm just wondering if the state of New Hampshire gets into the mix.
I believe they have can comment, obviously, on and participate in it.
Steve Skibnowski has his hand up. He's a scientist.
Steve may be trying to answer that question.
Gentleman in the back.
Yes, Steve Skibnowski. I do have some experience with the permitting process as a result of the work that I did at Vermont Yankee. The NPDES permit that we have at Vermont Yankee, still have it, is actually issued by the state of Vermont, because the state of New Hampshire controls up to what they call the low water mark, which is somewhere out in the river. But I would say also that we at one time did have a New Hampshire NPDES permit, but it's essentially just parroted what the Vermont permit had to say. And I imagine anything, at least in Vernon, would probably fall under that type of control issued by ANR. That would be my assessment at this point.
Further questions? The back of the room over on the far side.
Art Miller. I want to speak probably to the elephant that's in the room, that is to the location of said plant. We have been approached by the developers. Obviously, we own the farm, Miller Farm, right here in the center of town. We would rather be farming than be in the center of a conflict, especially with the reformer, and who knows what our neighbors and everybody else will think or say. Historically, obviously, we've stayed on the farm, and the town's been very supportive of that. When Velco was putting their switch yard in, they approached us about that, and they obviously wanted to put the switch yard where one of the proposed spots is for the plant. We did not entertain that, and Patty was very influential in helping us to preserve the farm. Within our own family, we've been discussing this topic, how do we handle the plant? We've kind of waited to see what the town referendum would be, because we don't want to be in the middle of conflict. We'd rather be farmers, and farmers tend to be more passive than that. But we have been approached by it. And there's a series of reasons why we are maybe being more open-minded to this than the Velco station. To me, one of the primary reasons is when we look at the energy creation in our state. For those of us who are citizens here in Vernon, we've obviously had a nuke plant that's been a high impact to our town in a positive way, at least for us as neighbors to Vermont Yankee. They've been great neighbors to us for 40 years plus, and we've appreciated our relationship with them. Obviously, losing the plant has been significant to our town, and the Planning Commission here has looked for other industries to come in and help replace that. That's a serious employer, a serious investment. There's not many businesses that'll plunk down $750 million in a town. I mean, we're not going to put up little shops by the side of the road of that magnitude. But also, when we look at the state and generation right now, the state's options are like biomass, which I believe the Planning Commission looked at. It would basically deforest a good chunk of the state of Vermont to put in a biomass plant. Solar has been batted around. Solar companies go first primarily to open land, i.e. farms, especially farms near a nuke plant, i.e. the Miller Farm. We have not entered into any agreement with them. Again, we could have reaped the benefit of the location of the farm. In my rough estimation, to do enough solar to replace a Vermont Yankee would be somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 acres. And again, they are targeting farmland. They've offered us insane amount of money to sell the farm to put up solar. So to us, solar is not a viable option. I always wanted to ask the governor, I've said for years, I have one question for the governor. Do you want an organic dairy farm or do you want solar farms? Because we are an organic dairy farm. And but I haven't met the governor yet. He hasn't stopped by. So to us, solar is not a viable option as far as production as a state. Wind, obviously, again, it does not seem like a viable option. Biomass does not seem like a viable option. We like the nuclear option, but obviously that's not an option. You're not going to dam up more rivers and streams, at least not of that magnitude. So to us, the gas plant seems like a very viable option for us to consider. My understanding is the state of Vermont imports somewhere about 80, or needs about 80, or produces about 15% of the power that the state uses right now. And so it has this huge gap within the state. My understanding, I'm not really up on it, but my understanding the state has to bring in an import like 85% of the power that it needs.
Art, I hate to interrupt you, but if you could wrap it up.
Okay? My final thought is Millers have not entered into an agreement, but we are open with Don and his colleagues at this point. Thank you, Tim.
Further questions? Over on the side, over here.
Very classy.
Bruce Gall, I just want to clarify on this vote. I know it's a non-binding vote, but my understanding is just a vote to find out if there's enough interest in the town for you to continue your investigation. It's not a vote saying, yes, build the plant. I mean, further questions are going to come up on location and some other questions, but at this point, we're just trying to find out if there's enough interest for you to continue.
That's exactly what it is. Nothing more, nothing less.
Further questions? Oh gosh, let's see here. The young lady in the light blue.
I think what it really comes down to is money and our taxes. And so I have called Middletown, the town clerk's office, and asked them what they received in revenue. And they negotiated with the gas plant in lieu of taxes. And so over a 35-year period, I think, I think it might be called a pilot. So their tax rate for the gas plant starts out low. And then over the next 35 years, it reaches the highest level. And I didn't bring my figures with me, but I don't think it's anywhere near $230 million that Vermont Yankee is giving in taxes now.
They don't give $230 million. Vermont Yankee doesn't give $230 million. They're assessed at $200 million. So last year, by our tax rate, they paid $1.2 million to the town. That is going to decrease, as you saw by the numbers, substantially. And it's really hard to compare one state from another because our taxes, the way we tax is so different from state to state. And many states do reach into negotiations on, payments from companies. It happens all the time. So Vermont would be actually totally different. So the best we can do is go by what our tax rate is. And the figures that you saw on that sheet was with a 1% increase in our cost year over year, which is very difficult to keep to. So it's probably going to be higher than what it was. But we went by our tax rate and what the book value, the grand list value is of that property, because that is how we tax in Vermont. So the numbers that we showed you are what would happen in our state. Now, would the state of Vermont maybe get into negotiations with the gas company? And therein, yes, they would, but that's different than our property taxes.
One thing we learned when we went to Middletown is the site they developed the plant in was what they call a brownfield. It was a contaminated hazardous waste site. It was a feldspar mine, and it was a big liability, spewing pollution into the river. So the gas company developer of the plant agreed to clean up that situation and turn that property into a taxable asset rather than a liability. So the term pilot is payment in lieu of taxes. So they negotiated their own deal, which was a win-win according to the town of Middletown and the gas company.
And if you noticed, if you read about the TDI transmission line that's coming in, they also, when they made their announcement, they talked about the pilot money that they got. So that, I believe those are always separate negotiations for various pilot programs. And I think, was it $700 million? The transmission line was $700 million over 40 years in pilot money to the state of Vermont.
And if I can just pile on, one other thing is, in Middletown is a town that has quite a bit of commercial development as well as industrial development. There's a big Pratt & Whitney jet engine plant there. So they have a lot of tax base there. Here in Vernon, as VY dwindles down to zero in taxable value, it's basically us homeowners and farmers and no commercial development at all in town, so there's a big difference.
All right, Vernon?
Gosh, how come you do me and not the others?
You and I have history at town meeting.
He's also my next door neighbor. I want to speak to everybody, and I want to say, don't just listen to the naysayers, don't just listen to the planning commission. Do what Heather did, do what I've done. Call Middletown. I first called the press. They don't have an environmental reporter, so they put me on to the Hartford Courant. I called them, they never called me back. So the other day, I called the town office. No, excuse me. Who did I call? A realtor, Sterling Realtor. I talked to the guy today again. He was the head of the fire commissioners, which is like a board overseeing their fire station, their fire department. He was on the fire commission when the explosion happened. Since then, he answered a lot of questions for me. There are no noise problems. Some of them I didn't like the answers to, but they are the answers. Their property taxes have stabilized, their property values have stabilized. There's no health and safety problems that he is aware of. It's isolated, the plant is isolated among the industrial development. There's very few residential homes there. And Heather did find out when she called their town office, the plant is located on 160 acres. As Bob said in the November forum, that's a 6-mile drive into the plant. I don't think we have that space here. And today I decided to call Haddam, Connecticut, which is where there was a nuclear power plant that closed in 2004. I talked to the town clerk there. I said, why don't you have a nuclear power plant? I mean, why don't you have a gas plant here? He said, well, we were kind of concerned about the spent fuel stored on the site. Sound familiar? They also have been having, this is something I don't want to talk about, but it's true, their property taxes have gone up, their property values have gone down. We need to really think about this. I want to suggest to you, to everyone who lives in Vernon and even elsewhere, to call the towns. There are 9 other, that I'm aware of, 9 other gas plants in New England. Texas has a gazillion of them. California has power plants. Some of them are bio, some of them are mixed, like bio and gas backup. Don't just listen to me or some other naysayers or the Planning Commission. Make your own investigation. Thank you.
All right, next question, gentleman over on this other side with his hand up.
Hi, Martin. In your presentation, you suggested that property values would either stabilize or go up, primarily because of the fact that taxes are going down.
Yeah, I think that one of the factors that is impacting housing values in Vernon right now is that it's a pretty sure bet that taxes are going to go up. Now, there's other towns around that have even higher taxes, but you know that's a factor. So if it was known that our tax rates could be stabilized because there was a big addition to the tax roll, that would help to stabilize housing values. Wouldn't be the only thing that might stabilize values, but it'd be a factor.
Have you researched property values within a 1 and 2 mile radius of the plant?
No.
The property values dropped, estimated 7%. Give me a room. I live right down the road from where you guys are looking to do this. The other thing is emissions, okay? And you can figure out the emissions based on what kind of system you're putting in. I don't care if it's Mitsubishi, Siemens, GE. It can be top of the line, most efficient, most effective for a 600 megawatt plant. How many thousands of tons are going to come out of there every year?
We have that on a PowerPoint.
Do we know that yet?
Well, we don't know exactly what kind of plant there's going to be. This is the kind of question that, you know, the process that Bob outlined at the PSB and the Agency of Natural Resources, this is their job. It's, quite frankly, it's not the planning board's job or even expertise to be able to figure this out. So once the town says, if they say that we have a preference to go further and explore this, then we would get to that kind of a question. But right now, we don't even know which kind of a plant it is, or how big it's going to be, or where it's going to be. So these are questions that we just can't get into right now. It'll be part of the permitting process.
Oh my gosh, with the thought of it going, or the footprint being close to where the new plant was, okay, you got a school across the street. Now, with my limited research, and yeah, I go online, okay, everything I've read indicates that it's going to affect little kids. It's just going to do it. Every plant does, unless you hide it somewhere else. Now, I live a quarter mile from the new plant. I've got a 3-year-old daughter. These are the kinds of questions that need to be answered before we can even take a non-binding referendum vote. There's thousands of tons coming out of that stack. Now, these are just figures that I'm getting, and of course, don't take them, don't weigh them heavily, because I'm getting my references online and reading for my own reading. But in the Northeast, 1 out of 10 children from birth to the age of 13 have some sort of problem with their lungs, asthma, whatever it is, okay? Within a 2-mile radius of a fossil fuel power plant, that goes to 6 to 1. That goes to 16%. It's going to affect the kids. Can we save, we're talking about saving money, we're talking about our taxes going down, we're talking about all of that. But it affects me on 2 levels. It affects me because I live very closely to where the plant is, so my property value is going to go down. Secondly, okay, kids, and the thing is not only do you have the elementary school, you've got a preschool in there, you got 2 other preschools down the road, you've got 2 daycares, and you got a bunch of kids that live around this plant. Now, we're not an urban area, but my gosh, can we think about that? Can we think about our kids? This is an area right now that's booming. That is booming, okay, in the machine tool industry. We couldn't see about getting a machine tool company to come into this town and bring 100, 150 jobs instead of 20, 25. My gosh. And something that's going to pay this town through the years. We're trying to hit a home run. We're not even in the ballpark, folks. Thank you.
I guess I can't respond to the tax research you did, but after the first forum where there was concerns raised about health, I shared that concern, so I actually had done a month's worth of reading, and I guess I'm unsure where your sources were, and I'd be interested to see them. I've done what I would consider considerable research online and with environmental consultants who I'm friends with or have known from work. Everything that I've read and seen, looking at what I would consider both the very partisan left and the sort of energy side conservative, has been that the plants have very limited to negligible health impact on kids or others. So I think perhaps when you're looking at fossil fuels, you are actually looking at coal and petroleum-based, because the particulate matter, which somebody in that corner at the first forum, which maybe was you, sir, I don't know, was very, yeah, you had done some research and there were very valid concerns to be raised. Particulate matter and the things that affect lung health, nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, negligible, which I think we saw in the table. So for me, coming out of that first forum, sharing your concerns, having done both in my own interest and feeling a responsibility to look into those, I guess I've come out very much on the other side. I think as a community, kids, school, parent, otherwise, the health risk factors are minimal to none for us to worry about this calculus. Again, I can't speak to the income, whether it's going up or down, but.
Okay, other questions? Right there on the end of the red.
So I'll try to be concise. On the first question for you, Martin, if we don't have a proposal yet to review from the developer, where did all the very specific details of the PowerPoint for what was being proposed or not proposed, where did they all come from?
You talking about, for example, that it's 600 megawatts?
I'm talking about the size of the plant, the footprint of the plant, the size of the the stack.
Right, so the developers who, I think Don is here, and Hervey over there, maybe they have something to say to this, but that sort of is the ballpark number that has been under discussion right from the beginning. And I guess, if it's okay with the moderator, I'd like to ask Don to talk about, you know, how that size ballpark came about.
Well, I do have some. We'll get there. I have a question for them, so they may be able to answer that at the same time. A point, anybody who's interested, you can go to ISO New England, you can do a Google search and find the ISO website. Has a wealth of information. These are the folks that run our grid. There seems to be a certain misconception here about the power that Vermont needs, as though we have to build a plant in Vermont because Vermont Yankee is shutting down. And the grid doesn't have toll gates at the state line. In fact, if you go on, you can see how much of New England's power, and we all share in the power, comes from the various sources, whether it's wind or solar or gas or oil. There's a tremendous amount of stats that are there on the website. I urge everybody to go to it. What I'm hearing so far is we don't yet have a formal proposal to put a plant. We have a concept here. The idea is 2019 and 2020 we'll have this in operation. But so far we know we need to have 2 certificate of public good certificates in the state of Vermont. We've got all the pipeline siting issues, FERC issues. You have to get in line with ISO New England for the application process, which can take a couple of years. Don't even start with what it takes to get Velco to approve this. And as Mr. Skibnowski touched on, some pretty significant issues with the discharge permits and the water draw permits, thermal permits for the state of Vermont. I see those as huge roadblocks. On top of that, we have Acts 56, which just passed the renewable energy standard, which Vermont has passed, which kind of dissuades against putting fossil fuels into the system. Lest we forget, the state of Vermont has a power generation tax. The states around us don't have an additional surcharge, which makes power plants uncompetitive here. We have a statewide property tax. Compare that with New Hampshire, which has the enterprise zone over in the Hinsdale area. And in Massachusetts, based on the number of gas plants they have, they're gas friendly, they have a whole pipeline running through them. Some areas have hundreds of acre parcels that are owned by major power companies that do have gas pipelines going. With all of that, I'm trying to figure out what's really going on here. This just doesn't seem to me as though it's on the ground, realistic, and something is doable. It's almost, and I don't mean this insultingly, it's just how it comes across, almost like it's going in to buy a car, and you've got to make this agreement, you've got to get this done. We need you to say yes. This car's only going to be here for a limited time. I remember a year or so ago, at one of the planning commission meetings, hearing the developer saying, we need to have a decision by the townspeople in about a year so that we can move forward because there's timelines on this. I'd like to hear, and then I'll shut up, I'd like to hear the developers actually come up and, if they could in a couple of minutes, give us a pitch on why what I'm talking about here doesn't seem nuts, but is reasonable and doable, and why we can really get this thing going in 2019 or 2020, and why Vernon, Vermont, and not Massachusetts or New Hampshire.
This might be easier if I speak from the podium. First thing, I want to dispel a notion that we're the developer. I think that we've done this kind of free form, and you need to be able to identify a person, as the entity or the agent. And that's the function that Herbie and I have assumed here. In terms of working towards this and trying to put it together, we work pretty proactively, I think, with the Planning Commission that has done a lot of its own data, frequently, giving us a whole lot of enlightenment, and it's been vice versa. So when we talked about roughly a 600 megawatt type plant, we were just looking at something that would plug into the existing substation. And we know that from a power flow analysis perspective, we know that that's worked for the last 42 years. So that seemed like a good place to start. So that's really the genesis of 600. It could be more, it could be less. It's a good site. It has the pre-existing infrastructure. It has rail. I'm a little bit taken aback in terms of the announcement on site tonight. I think that's really positive in terms of moving forward. This is the other side of the substation. Siting a plant there will mitigate all the transmission towers that we talked about earlier. It's just a good location. Could this be done in Massachusetts or New Hampshire? I think the answer is yes. If we were to buy power from that plant, we're essentially exporting our tax base, in my view. We're also exporting a relatively small number of jobs, but a significant number of construction jobs in the short term. So this is an efficient place to put a plant. I think that from a reliability perspective, I think that this is we have the ability to maybe plug a hole here. Now, that will be, that sort of analysis on my part, that's subject to a more comprehensive power flow analysis. And to your point, why don't you have a plan in front of you? That was actually by design. I think that when you read about wind, or you read about some of the 100-acre solar projects that developers have announced, where they've lined up site control and they're moving ahead, and they've done it totally absent of any kind of community involvement. We've been doing the community involvement for the last year and a half, 2 years, and we've just been suggesting ideas. We haven't come in and said, this is what we want to do, this is what's going to happen in your backyard. We've been just the opposite of that. I think that we've tried to develop the consensus so that we can rationalize with the investors the ability to raise the money to pursue the 248 permitting and all the little sub-permits that go into that, and start the public process. I mean, I think that's one of the misconceptions, that March 1st, it's all over and you don't have a say in it. By design, the Act 248 process is just ongoing, and it is a public process. You can intervene in it, and it's all designed to give as much information as possible to all the stakeholders. I don't know if that's been responsive or.
And can I just add something to that too, Don? Part of the reason that we're looking at this now, and the reason that if you think we're pushing it forward, we are, is because the pipeline is coming. So we do have a bit of a limited time frame in terms of getting that pipeline spur built. when the pipeline is under construction as well. That's what gave us the idea in the first place.
It is something of a sun, the moon, the stars alignment here. VY closes, that opens up the substation. The pipeline is routing some 7 miles in a direct path from where we are, and it's worth considering. We're not actively selling this as the right thing. What we're saying is, if this is consistent with the town goals and the town's objectives, we can put those pieces together. We can raise the VC capital to apply for the Act 248 permit and start the process. This is not going to be easy, but if this is something that is right for the town, and when you vote on it, you collectively agree that that's the right path to go. We can mobilize all the resources to get moving, and I think as we move along, you'd see pretty quickly, once we get past the referendum, a lot more things will become transparent in terms of who the investor are, what the likelihood is, what the feasibility is. What I can tell you from an energy perspective is that New England needs the power. New England ISO has put together new forward capacity auction rules for new capacity, specifically new capacity, and of the capacity that's currently in the queue, the new generating capacity. This would be the first that would be able to use Marcellus gas off the Ned pipeline, and that is significant to all of New England's reliability. So New England needs the power. Whether Vermont actually wants to contract for the power, that's a whole different issue. But I can tell you this is that today Vermont utilities purchase power resources off the New England ISO grid short term. So this will be one of the plants that would feed into that. The last point that I'd make, and sorry if I'm going long-winded and sort of Hamlet here, but the last point that I'd make is one that I made in the first meeting. The average locational marginal unit for an oil and gas heat rate in New England ISO is about 8,000 BTU requirement. And we're looking at something that might be 30% less fuel. And that's a real significant number. You're burning less fuel, you're emitting less. And the other really good thing about this, if you're interested in kicking a coal plant out of the dispatch curve, if you're interested in trying to close a coal plant down, plants like this are the things that are needed. The really horrible thing, I was a former utility investment banker, and I toured a lot of those coal plants in the Appalachians, in Ohio, where you'd go and you'd have a meeting and you'd walk into the admin room and there would be pictures of like Eisenhower and Truman on the wall. That's how long they'd been in service, that's how long they'd been in operation. The best route to get to the emissions that you want and the cost structure that you want, I think, is to turn over the technology. Just much the same way that everybody here probably turns in their PC every few years and upgrades. It's the same thing that I think can happen here. And if we do it, as I say, I think we get a couple of coal plants.
Is there anybody else who hasn't asked a question yet that wants to ask? Gentleman in the back of the room.
Actually, not a question, a comment. Is that okay?
Go for it.
Okay, my name's Bob Dickerman. I'm from Northfield. I just wanted to answer the gentleman's question over here about how much would come out of the smokestacks. In Northfield, our compressor station is going to have a gas turbine to drive the compressor. It's going to be 1/20th the size of the one that's being proposed here. The mass flow rate through that exhaust stack will be 20 million pounds a day of exhaust, 20 million pounds per day. The one here would be 20 times more than that about, so it would be a couple 100 million pounds per day. Most of that would be just hot air, but it's contaminated with the NOx and the carbon monoxide and the radium and the VOCs and all that in small amounts. It's so much here that it's going to be a couple 1,000 pounds per second come out of the stacks. You're right to be concerned if you're nearby. We are, those of us who are living nearby. People living closest would be affected the most, we think. We just went to a seminar the other day put on by the Southwestern Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. And they stress that people living nearby would be affected the most, which makes sense. Depends on the weather. If there's cloud cover, or light or no winds, calm winds, you're affected the most. So a lot of things matter. And children, we think, I've read, are affected the most. So that's what we know from where we stand. And by the way, I'm the chairman of the subcommittee to the Board of Health in Northfield on this project, on the compressor station and pipeline. We're having a meeting, our first meeting tomorrow night at 6 o'clock at the town library. You're all invited to come. There's not going to be a lot of time to discuss a lot of things because we have kind of a full agenda already, but you're welcome to come and hear our concerns. Thank you.
Anybody else who has not asked a question yet, right down front here. I want to make sure that people who haven't had a chance to ask questions get those.
I'm Norma Manning, I'm a town resident, and I'm employed at this school. I think we all can speculate we're not going to enjoy the safety and low emissions that we have for 40 years that nuclear power has afforded us. But I also know that because we had activists and protesters and people who pushed the issue, and Vermont had the lowest emissions requirement for nuclear power of any state in the United States. I guess what I'm wondering here is, can we expect to have the same level of scrutiny for this form of energy as well?
Well, again, as Bob went through the detail of the Act 248 process, and also the state and federal air emissions permits. Yeah, I think that's a very detailed scrutiny process that this would go through, and that it's certainly not, a done deal or something that there isn't plenty of opportunity to ask these kinds of questions and to intervene if people want to, and to really get the facts, because that's what that process does, as opposed to, surfing the web and getting numbers off of them.
Yeah, if you look at the Citizens Guide to the air permits, there is a lot of discussion about ongoing monitoring systems once the facilities are running, with automated sensors built in, inspections by the regulators, procedures to address failures or non-compliance. So it is a very regulated activity. I mean, VY was so regulated, I think, we all felt some, as residents, we had on-site resident inspectors there 24 hours a day. So I don't think they put on-site live-in inspectors with gas plants, but they are regulated. So you got a follow-up there?
One follow-up, please.
So your feeling is that, unlike what was going on with the wind turbines, with the citizens' complaints and the infractions that are occurring there, and people feeling like they're forced off their land, your feeling is that we would have a more receptive state government to receive our complaints and concerns? Do we have reason to?
I can't compare it to whatever wind project you're talking about. I don't have any knowledge of that, so I can't answer that.
But again, certainly through the process, there are many points at which interveners are possible and questions can be asked and comments will be made.
Again, the Planning Commission wanted to wrap this up by 8 o'clock, and I know that all of you have a lot more questions that the Commission will be able to answer on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that we have not taken a position on this, as Martin said. We also have not been out pushing and advocating this beyond, we're not even advocating it, frankly. We aren't going out to the governor's office, we're not going out to the Regional Planning Commission, we're not asking anyone to help us with this evaluation yet. We want to see what the town votes March 1st. Is this something you want to continue? If the vote is no, we're done. Frankly, it's a lot of time for volunteer board, so we have other issues we could deal with. So, but if the town feels strongly and we are volunteers and we are trying to help out the town. So that's where we're coming from. And we do appreciate all this concern and questions, and we have lots of opportunity to discuss this further. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to wrap it up.